In this lecture, I will walk you through the template.aml file that will be fed to the CloudFormation to create the infrastructure or the resources for our use case. Our use case has two Lambda functions, one to create the order in the database. The second one is to read the order information from the database. Then we have the API gateway, which will host two endpoints. The first endpoint to create the Lambda function. The end user will use a HTTP post method to hit that URL. When the Lambda is triggered, it will take the information, create a user in the database and send the response back. The second URL of the API gateway is to read the order information from the database. When that is hit by the end user, that URL, it will trigger the second Lambda function, which will read the order details and send those details back to the API gateway, and that will go back to the client. So we have all these here, and the template.aml will look as follows. You will be creating this from scratch in the next few lectures. This is just an overview. You already know the basics, the first few lines of the template.aml file where we define the template format and all that, the description, etc. Let's go to the resources block, which is the most important block, under which we have two Lambda functions defined: create order function and read orders function. You know the first few blocks here, the type, the properties, code URI and handler. The two new blocks you will be using are the events block and the policies block. Take a look at the events block. This is the block which we use to define the events that trigger our Lambda function above. In this case, there is an order events of type API because the API gateway is the one which is triggering our Lambda. If it is a S3 event, then we'll have S3 here instead of API. And then we define the properties for the API gateway. This is called implicit way of defining a resource. Instead of explicitly defining the API gateway as a separate resource like our Lambda function, as we define our Lambda function, within that we have an implicit block called events. Within that you define the API, provide the properties, /path. This is the URL with which this API endpoint should be created, and it should be binded to the HTTP method post. With this 5 or 6 lines of code here, we are doing a lot of work. Thanks to SAM, it makes our job a lot easy. It creates an API gateway endpoint with this information we provide here. Not only that, once that API gateway endpoint is created, it will bind that to our Lambda here. So that API gateway will automatically trigger this Lambda function. All that will be done for us magically. This is for the creation of order in the database. The second Lambda function is for reading the order information from the DynamoDB database. If you look at the events block, it is very similar, except we use HTTP method get to get the order information. So that is about the events section or block, which is implicit way of defining the event that triggers our Lambda. Automatically that event will be that resource will be created and it will be binded as a trigger to our Lambda function. Next, we need the DynamoDB database table. For that, we explicitly define a resource here under the resources section along with our Lambda functions. You define a DynamoDB table resource like this with 5 lines of code. Type is simple table. Properties are primary key of the database, which is database table, which is the ID field, order ID of type number. That's it. With that much, CloudFormation will create a database for us. It will create a table inside that database called orders table, and then using this as the primary key. Once the table is created, to refer to the table within our Lambda functions, and also here when we define security policies, we use the intrinsic function not ref. Also, since our Lambda functions, when we create them, need access to this table, we define an environment variable called orders_table, and we use the intrinsic function called reference and assign that table that gets created dynamically at runtime. We need access to that. So we use this intrinsic function, assign that table reference to this order_table. We read this as environment variable within our Lambda function so that we can access this table. And as you can see, we define a globals block. and the properties under it are the common properties for these two Lambda functions. Instead of repeating this runtime, memory size, timeout, and environment information for both the Lambda functions, we can use a globals block. You will learn about it in lectures later on. It is very straightforward. As I said, all the common properties for various Lambda functions within a template.aml can be defined under the globals block. Last and very important piece here is this policies section, where we define the security policy for our Lambda function. I'll be talking more about it later, but it's as simple as the permissions that our Lambda function requires to do its job. In this case, the policy is DynamoDB CRUD policy. These policies are already defined in SAM and in CloudFormation. As the name itself says, DynamoDB CRUD policy. This will give our Lambda function the permissions to perform CRUD operations against the DynamoDB database tables. But which table? We only give the minimum permissions always. Table name is the order table which we are creating. This Lambda function cannot perform CRUD operations against any other table except for the orders table. Similarly, the second Lambda function's policies, if you look at it, we define DynamoDB read policy. The read orders Lambda function cannot perform CRUD operations. It can only perform the read operation. And against which table? The orders table. So you will define two Lambda functions, define the events that will trigger those Lambda functions, create a DynamoDB table under the resources section, and then use that table in your Lambda functions. Also define policies for your Lambda functions against that table. You will also learn how to use the outputs block, which I'll explain in detail at the end of the section.